The boy had been unconscious for 11 hours. When he opened his eyes, he didn't cry. He didn't call for his mother. He didn't look around the room the way children do when they wake somewhere unfamiliar, scanning, afraid, needing reassurance. He looked directly at his father, and his expression was not a 4-year-old's expression. Then he spoke. "I am my father's father," he said. "I came back. I didn't finish what I needed to do." His mother, Claire, was squeezing his hand so hard her knuckles had gone white. She opened her mouth to say something gentle and deflecting. "You're okay, baby, it was just a dream." But the words didn't come, because she was watching her husband. Daniel Calloway stood at the foot of the hospital bed and did not move, did not blink, did not say a single word. His face had gone completely, deliberately blank. Not the blank of shock, not the slack-jawed confusion of a father hearing something impossible from his child. The blank of someone who had been waiting. Nathan's eyes shifted slowly toward the window. He added, almost as an afterthought, in the same calm voice, "Tell Grandma I forgive her. She knows what she did." Then he closed his eyes and slept. Eleanor Calloway, Daniel's mother, had been dead for 6 years, and she had died, as far as anyone knew, with her secrets fully intact. She hadn't. Before Nathan was born, the Calloway marriage looked, from the outside, like exactly what it was supposed to be. Daniel and Claire met at 28, married at 31, bought a house with a porch in Westbrook, Ohio, and tried for nearly 2 years before Claire finally saw 2 lines on a test and cried alone in the bathroom before telling him. Not from joy exactly, but from relief, from the private collapse of a fear she had never said out loud. Daniel was an accountant, methodical, self-contained, good at appearing present. Claire was a physical therapist with a talent for reading bodies and, she had always believed, people. She had spent years professionally trained to notice things most people looked past. Tension in a jaw, weight shifted to the wrong foot, the particular stillness of someone holding something back. She was, in other words, exactly the kind of person who should have seen it coming. She didn't. Or maybe she did, and filed it under things I will examine later, the way all of us do. What she knew about Daniel's parents could be summarized in 4 minutes. His father Robert had died of a heart attack when Daniel was in his late 30s. His mother Eleanor had followed 3 years later, a stroke, quick. Daniel was an only child. He did not speak of them often, and when he did, it was with a flatness that Claire had spent years misreading as grief. It wasn't grief. Nathan arrived in March looking serious. That was the word Claire would use later when she tried to explain it to people who hadn't been there. He didn't look like a newborn. He looked like someone considering a problem. The first strange thing happened when Nathan was 14 months old. Daniel's parents had left behind a small cardboard box of photographs that had never been sorted or framed or put into albums. Just a box on the closet shelf, the way families have boxes like that, always meaning to go through them and never quite getting there. Claire had the box out one afternoon, meaning to find something for a frame she'd bought, and Nathan pulled himself up on the edge of the coffee table and stared at a photograph of Robert Calloway, Daniel's father, dead before Nathan was born, with an attention that was, even at 14 months, odd. Not curious, fixed. He reached for the photo with both hands. Claire let him hold it. He looked at it for almost 2 full minutes without losing interest, without dropping it, without putting it in his mouth the way babies put everything in their mouths. Then he pressed it flat to his chest, the way you'd hold something you didn't want taken from you. Daniel walked in from the kitchen, saw what Nathan was holding, and set down his coffee cup a little too carefully. "He was just playing," Claire said. "I know," Daniel said. He put the photograph back in the box and put the box back on the shelf. When Nathan was 2.5, he walked to that same shelf, pointed to Robert's photograph, and said, "That's mine." Claire corrected him gently. Nathan shook his head once and walked away. When he was 3, he told Claire that their house smelled wrong, that his house had smelled like pine and something burning, like a wood stove. Their house had central heating and laundry detergent. He said it the way he said most things, not like a child testing out words, but like someone reporting a fact they expected to be agreed with. When he was 3.5, he said to Daniel, without preamble, without looking up from his toys, "You were always scared of me, even before." Daniel put down his coffee. He said, very quietly, "What did you say to me?" Nathan stood up and walked to the backyard. Daniel did not tell Claire. Claire only found out later from Nathan himself, who referenced it casually during a car ride and had no idea it was new information. The year Nathan turned 4, he called out from the hallway one evening in a sleepy voice, "Don't let Grandma go yet. She has something she needs to give you." There was no one in the hallway. Daniel was in the kitchen. Claire watched his back go rigid. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the counter, not turning around. Then he said, to no one, "Go to sleep, buddy." He slept on the couch that night. He said it was because of his back. The appendicitis announced itself quietly, the way the worst things tend to. Sunday, Nathan seemed off, tired, not eating. By Monday evening, he had a temperature and was pressing his hand to his lower right side. Claire had been a physical therapist long enough to recognize the specific quality of pain that doesn't wait, the still, concentrated kind, the kind that doesn't respond to distraction. They were at Mercy General before noon on Tuesday. By 2 o'clock, the surgeon was telling them it had already ruptured and they needed to move immediately. Claire signed the consent forms. Her handwriting was steady. She had decided it would be. What she noticed, in the half hour they sat waiting for the OR to be prepped, was that Daniel didn't touch her once, didn't reach for her hand, didn't put a hand on her shoulder. He sat 2 chairs away and looked at the floor, and she understood, not consciously, not yet, that he was afraid of something the surgery itself didn't explain. She told herself, "He's scared for Nathan, that's all." The surgery took 6 hours. The monitoring took 5 more. Claire sat in the waiting room and prayed in the specific, bargaining way that people pray when they have stopped believing in bargains but don't have anything else. She prayed for Nathan to survive. She prayed, separately, and she could not have explained why she needed it to be separate, for him to come back the same. She would find out later that the second prayer was the more complicated one. He was awake for less than 3 minutes before he said it. His eyes opened the way Nathan's eyes always opened, not gradually, not blinking into focus, but all at once, like a switch. No anesthesia fog, no searching confusion. He looked at Claire first, and then at the window, and then, with a deliberateness that made the back of Claire's neck prickle, at Daniel. "Mom." His voice was roughed up by the intubation tube, but his tone wasn't a child's. It was the tone of someone with things to say before time runs out. "I'm right here," Claire said. "Right here, baby. You're safe." He looked at Daniel, and what crossed his face then wasn't love, or relief, or the simple joy of a sick child seeing his father. It was something older and heavier. Recognition with a complicated past attached to it. "I am my father's father," he said. "I came back. I didn't finish what I needed to do." Claire's mouth opened. She had 3 or 4 reasonable things ready. It's the anesthesia. Kids say strange things. He's been through a lot. She had them lined up and was reaching for the first one. Then she looked at Daniel. His face had gone utterly still. Not surprised, not worried, not reaching for an explanation the way parents automatically reach for explanations when their children say something alarming. His face had done something Claire had no word for until later, when she turned it over enough times to find one. Braced. Like a man who had heard a sound in the dark that he'd been expecting for years. "Tell Grandma I forgive her," Nathan said. "She knows what she did." Then his eyes closed and he was asleep again, and he would stay asleep for 4 more hours. And when he woke the second time, he asked for apple juice and didn't remember any of it. Or said he didn't. Claire looked at her husband across the hospital bed where their 4-year-old son slept. Daniel was staring at the floor. He didn't look up. That was the moment. That was the exact moment, though she didn't understand it fully until much later. She had been married to this man for 9 years, and she had never once seen him unable to meet her eyes. The drive home happened 3 days later, when Nathan was cleared and bouncing more or less and asking about cartoons. Claire spent the 40-minute drive constructing explanations the way you stack sandbags, urgently, knowing they probably won't hold. Anesthesia hallucinations were documented. Children spoke strangely emerging from sedation. There was a whole body of literature. My father's father was a grammatically unusual phrase, but not a cognitively impossible one for a 4-year-old who'd overheard adults discussing family. The business about grandma was suggestibility, something seen on television, a dream that stuck. She almost believed it. In the passenger seat, Daniel drove and said nothing. What Nathan said in the hospital, Claire started. Anesthesia, Daniel said, no pause. He's 4, Claire. Which was exactly the right response, perfectly calibrated. And that calibration, the zero hesitation of it, the complete absence of I know, it unsettled me too. That was what she took home and turned over in her mind for 11 days. She did not bring it up again. She watched Nathan instead. It started with the name of a dog. Nathan was on the couch one afternoon, still in the soft, slow recovery of a child recently repaired, watching television. A golden retriever appeared in a commercial. Nathan pointed at it without taking his eyes off the screen. Grandpa Robert had one like that, he said. He called it Jasper. Claire went absolutely still. She had never heard the name Jasper. Daniel almost never spoke of his father. In 9 years of marriage, she could count the meaningful stories about Robert Calloway on one hand. She had seen maybe 3 photographs. Where did you hear that? She asked. I just know, Nathan said. The way he said it wasn't evasive. It was tired, like a question he'd already answered too many times. That night, after Nathan was asleep, Claire went to the hall closet. She went through the boxes she had never properly gone through, the ones from Daniel's parents' estate, still packed the way they'd arrived 7 years ago. She found a photograph she'd never seen before. Robert Calloway, young, standing on a porch, a golden retriever sitting at his feet. On the back, in old pencil, Bobby and Jasper, summer 74. She put it back in the box. She didn't tell Daniel. 3 days later, Nathan told her, with the same flat certainty. His grandmother Eleanor had kept a blue tin of hard candies on the kitchen windowsill. She used to hum while she cooked. Always the same song, never the words, just the melody. And she and Grandpa Robert had fought badly in the last year. A real fight. The kind you don't come back from. Because Eleanor had done something that couldn't be undone, and Robert had found out. Claire found the blue tin in the same closet that night. There were 3 hard candies inside, fused together with age. She sat on the closet floor for a while with the tin in her lap. Then Nathan called her name from his bedroom, and she put the tin in her pocket and went. Daniel had a cousin named Margaret, late 50s, retired school teacher, the only member of the Calloway family Claire had ever met more than twice. Margaret had grown up 2 streets from the Calloway house in Hargrove. She had known Daniel's parents well. She knew where things were buried, even if she'd never dug. Claire invited her for dinner in December, 6 weeks after the hospital. She told herself it was a family dinner, a celebration of Nathan's recovery. She told herself a lot of things. What she actually wanted was to put Nathan and Margaret in the same room and see what happened. Dinner was quiet until dessert. Margaret was in the middle of a story about Daniel as a boy, a school play, something sweet, when Nathan looked up from his cake and said, without any particular urgency, "She called the night before. Eleanor. She called the house and said she was sorry. She said he deserved to know the truth, but nobody picked up." The table dropped into silence. "Who called, baby?" Claire asked. "Eleanor," Nathan said. He looked at his plate. "She said sorry too late." Margaret Calloway's fork hit the table. Not dropped, set down, but hard, like a reflex she didn't manage to control. And then something happened that Claire would replay for years. Margaret looked at Nathan, not with confusion, Not with the polite, "What a peculiar thing to say" face of an adult managing a child's strange comment, but with the face of someone who had just heard something confirmed. She looked at Nathan, and then she looked at Daniel, and Daniel looked at the window. The window. He could not look at his wife, could not look at his cousin, could not look at his son. He looked at the window, and his jaw was tight enough to cut glass. "I should get going," Margaret said. She was in her car in under 10 minutes. Claire reached the front porch just in time to see the headlights swing out of the driveway. Margaret did not call for 9 days. When she finally did, she said she'd been unwell. She sounded like someone who'd decided how much she was going to say and was holding firmly to it. Claire had decided by then to go and find what Margaret wouldn't tell her. Claire was not impulsive. She was the kind of person who built a case before she made an accusation, who needed the ground solid before she put weight on it. But she had noticed enough, and what she'd noticed had a shape now. She started with the boxes in the hall closet, cataloging everything this time, properly, with a notepad. Insurance documents, birthday cards, photographs with names she didn't know on the backs. She called Margaret and was careful and patient and friendly and extracted through 20 minutes of conversation one useful thing: the name of Eleanor's oldest friend. A woman named Dorothy, still living in Hargrove, 60 miles east. Claire drove out on a Tuesday while Nathan was at preschool. She did not tell Daniel where she was going. Dorothy lived in a small, clean house that smelled like that whole era. Old wood, dried flowers, things kept exactly where they'd always been kept. She was 73, arthritic, and sharp in the way that women who've kept secrets for decades tend to stay sharp, because the secret gives them something to maintain, something that keeps the mind from going soft. She opened the door, looked at Claire for a long moment, and said, "You're Daniel's wife." It wasn't a question. "Something's happened," Claire said. "Yes." Dorothy stepped back to let her in. "It usually does, eventually." Over tea, Claire laid it out. The hospital, the words, the dog's name, the blue tin, Margaret's face at the dinner table. She kept her voice steady. She presented it the way she would present evidence to a colleague, not a confession to a stranger. Dorothy listened without interrupting. When Claire finished, she was quiet for almost a full minute, looking out at her backyard, at a bird feeder swaying in the cold. The silence had a texture to it, like something being weighed. "I always thought," she said finally, "that if it ever came out, it would come out through Daniel. I never imagined a child would be the one to say it." "Say what?" Claire asked. Dorothy looked at her with something that wasn't quite pity, something more like respect for what Claire was about to have to carry. "How much," Dorothy said, "do you actually know about Robert Calloway?" Robert Calloway had not died leaving only Daniel. He had a son before Daniel. A son born when Robert was 23, before Eleanor, before the money, before the entire life Robert had eventually constructed for himself. The mother's name was Patricia Voss, a woman Robert had lived with for 2 years in Hargrove, a woman he had loved, according to Dorothy, as fully as he'd ever loved anything. The pregnancy was real. The love was real. And then Eleanor Marsh arrived. Eleanor's family had money of a particular kind. Not the kind that announced itself, but the kind that made everything easier and nothing free. Robert was a young man with no safety net and a talent for making calculations. He made one. He left Patricia quietly. No scene, no formal ending, just a drift that became a departure, and married Eleanor within the year. Patricia's child wasn't an obstacle Robert agonized over. He was a ledger item Robert closed. Patricia named the boy Thomas. She raised him alone in Hargrove. She never told him who his father was. She said only that he was a man who had decided not to stay. That was the whole story Thomas grew up with. That single sentence, offered once, never expanded on. He was allowed to understand that he had been chosen against, and nothing more. Thomas grew up, left at 20, moved west, and disappeared into the ordinary life of someone trying not to need things they were never given. Dorothy lost track of him by the late 1980s. Eleanor had known about Thomas before she and Robert were married. She'd always known. That was the part that landed hardest when Dorothy said it. Eleanor hadn't been blindsided. She had negotiated. She had made the terms of her knowledge very clear, very early, in that bloodless way she had. The subject was closed. Robert's financial life was tied to her family's money. The alternative to silence was ruin. She hadn't buried a secret, she had built on top of one. Robert was silent for 30 years. But in his last 2 or 3 years, the years when men sometimes look back and find the accounting doesn't add up, he'd begun trying to find Thomas. He'd asked Dorothy for help. He'd searched. And Dorothy believed he had found him, found an address, a name, a city. But Robert died in his garage on a Wednesday morning before he'd done anything with it. Heart attack. Sudden. The search died with him. Eleanor died less than a year later. But the night before her body was found, she had called someone. Dorothy didn't know who. A neighbor had heard Eleanor on the phone through the wall, saying she was sorry, saying that someone deserved to know the truth. And then she died, and took the name with her. Until a 4-year-old boy was split open and put back together, and woke up with someone else's unfinished business in his mouth. Claire drove home from Hargrove with the windows down. November, 40 degrees. She needed the cold, because she needed something real on her skin while her mind did what it was doing. Here is what she knew by the time she pulled into the driveway. Robert Calloway had fathered a child before his marriage, deliberately abandoned that child for money, and spent 30 years pretending the child didn't exist. Eleanor had enforced the silence and leveraged Robert's financial dependence to maintain it. A man named Thomas had spent 60 years of his life with no father, no family history, no identity beyond a sentence his mother said once and never explained. Robert had tried to fix it and died too soon. Eleanor had tried to fix it and died too late. And Daniel knew. He had to. The hospital, Margaret's face, the way he had stood at that window with his jaw locked and his eyes somewhere else entirely. A man who didn't know would have reacted differently. A man who didn't know would have asked questions. Daniel sat very still for a very long time. Then, my mother told me when I was 17. She said there was a boy, before, that it had been handled, that I was never to bring it up to my father or anyone else. Handled. Her word. And when your father died, did he leave you anything about Thomas? Something shifted in Daniel's face. Something that had been held in place for a long time shifted. He left files, hidden in the basement, not with the regular boxes, a separate box under the stairs. Inside was a name, an address, a city. Claire looked at him carefully. Did you contact him? Daniel, did you contact Thomas? No. What did you do? He looked at the table. I burned them. The room went somewhere quiet and cold that it hadn't been before. You burned them, Claire said. There was a will, Claire. Eleanor left the house and the accounts to me. If Thomas existed, officially, legally, he had a claim. I was 39 years old with a wife and a mortgage, and you burned the only evidence that a man existed, Claire said. A man your father spent the last years of his life trying to reach. You had his name, his address, and you burned it to protect an inheritance. She heard herself say it and watched him absorb it, and the terrible thing was the way he absorbed it. Not with horror, not with the crumbling anguish of someone confronting what they'd done. He absorbed it the way you absorb a fact you've already cataloged. He had filed this under necessary years ago, and he had been maintaining the filing ever since. Look at me, she said. He did, and what she saw wasn't guilt in the way she'd expected. It was smaller than that, more ordinary. The face of a man who had made a calculation, lived with it quietly, and understood he might eventually be asked about it. He had prepared for this, she realized. Some part of him had always been prepared for this. He just hadn't known it would come through his own son's mouth. She went to bed without another word, because there was nothing she could say that the situation hadn't already said better. What followed was not resolution. Life doesn't provide that. What it provides is the next thing, and then the thing after that, and the weight doesn't leave, it just redistributes. In January, Claire hired a genealogical researcher. It took 6 weeks and a DNA database cross-reference to locate Thomas Voss. Thomas Voss Crawford now, 61 years old, a retired electrician in Spokane, Washington, with a daughter and 3 grandchildren, and, it turned out, half a decade of his own searching that had gotten him frustratingly close without ever connecting. He had found Robert Calloway's name in county records. He had found a death certificate. He had found no living relatives willing to respond. Someone had been ignoring him. Claire didn't have to wonder who. She sent a letter. She told Daniel she was doing it. She told him he could be part of it or not. He chose not. And the way he chose not told her everything she needed to know about the choices he'd been making for years. He retreated into a silence that she had once called quietness and now understood was something more intentional. A specific kind of absence that kept things from being asked, that foreclosed certain rooms and called it privacy. Thomas called 4 days after the letter arrived. He was careful on the phone, controlled. He cried once, briefly, and immediately apologized, and that apology, the reflex of a man who had spent 60 years minimizing his own needs so as not to seem demanding of things he'd been taught he had no right to, broke something open in Claire that she hadn't expected. He didn't want money. He said it 3 times in 3 different ways, as if he'd been afraid she'd assumed the worst. What he said instead was, "I just wanted to know if I was real to anyone in that family." Claire said, "You are. I promise you are." Margaret, reached by phone that same week, cried without apology and said she had suspected for 30 years but had been too afraid of Eleanor to ask. Too afraid, and then, later, too afraid of what it would mean to have stayed silent for so long, and said nothing. She flew to Spokane in the spring and sent Claire a photograph afterward. Her, and Thomas, and his daughter at a dinner table. All of them with the raw, unsteady happiness of people finding each other across a distance they didn't choose and couldn't undo. Daniel moved out in March. Not because Claire forced it. Because the architecture he had built, careful, sealed, protected, self-justifying, had a fracture through the center now, and he seemed to understand, in the wordless way he understood most things, that it wasn't going to hold. He saw Nathan on weekends. He sometimes called late in the evenings and said things that circled around apologies without quite landing on them, as if he were practicing a language he hadn't decided to learn yet. Nathan turned 5 in the spring and started kindergarten in the fall. He played soccer, badly, and loved it. He still watched people with that particular still attention that Claire had never found a word for, but he never again said anything that couldn't be accounted for by a normal 5-year-old living a normal 5-year-old life. He did not speak of the hospital. He did not speak of Robert or Eleanor or any of it. If he remembered, he gave no sign. Or he had simply put it down, the way something finished can finally be put down. There is a version of this story in which you can feel sorry for Daniel. He was 17 when Eleanor told him about Thomas. 17, in a family where love was financial and silence was the condition of receiving it. He didn't build the original lie. He inherited it the way you inherit a house with bad foundations. You didn't build it wrong, but you're living in it now, and at some point you have to decide whether to shore it up or tear it down. That version exists. Claire has sat with it. But here is the other version, the one that won't leave. Daniel was 39 years old when he found his father's hidden files. He was not a child. He was a husband, an adult, a man who had presumably thought of himself as a decent person for 39 years, and he had held a box of documents containing the name and address of a man who had spent his entire life not knowing he had a father, a half-brother, a family history, an identity. And he had fed those documents into a fire to protect a house and a set of accounts. Not in a moment of panic, not in a fog of grief. With a clear head, in a basement where no one could see him. He had made his mother's choice. He had repeated it cleanly, with full information, as an adult who knew exactly what he was doing and did it anyway. That is not a tragedy. That is a decision. Nathan had forced it into the light, through whatever door was available, a hospital room, 11 hours of unconsciousness, a child's small voice still hoarse from a breathing tube. Something had refused to stay buried. Claire didn't believe in the supernatural. She believed in her son. And she believed, perhaps, that some weight carried long enough by enough people eventually just falls, through whatever floor is weakest, into whatever space is open below. In May, Claire finally cleared the hall closet. It had been on her list for months. She'd been through those boxes twice, once in grief, once in investigation, and she had thought she knew what was in them. She did not know what was in them. At the bottom of a water-damaged address book, tucked so flat against the back cover that it was invisible unless you opened the book fully and pressed the spine, was a small, sealed envelope. In Eleanor's handwriting on the front, "For Daniel, when I am gone." It had never been opened. Claire stood in the hallway for a long moment. Then she opened it. Inside, one folded sheet of paper, and behind it, a DNA comparison result, the mail order kind, common in the early 2000s, dated 14 months before Eleanor's death. 2 samples, labeled only A and B, 49.8% shared DNA. Half-siblings. Claire read it twice. Then she stood very still and let her mind work through what it meant. Eleanor had found Thomas. Quietly, without telling anyone, without leaving any trail, she had found Robert's first son, and she had obtained a DNA test. She had confirmed everything Robert had spent his last years trying to prove. She had the result in her hands, and she had put it in an envelope addressed to her son, and she had called someone the night before she died and said she was sorry. And then she was gone. And the envelope sat in a box in a closet for 6 years while Daniel, who had burned his father's files, who had chosen the house and the accounts, who had made his choice with full awareness, lived under the same roof, paid the same bills, and never once went through those boxes with enough care to find it. Or had he found it? Had he opened it, read it, put it carefully back, and said nothing? Claire would never know. She had thought 6 months ago that she was learning who her husband was. She understood now that she had only learned as much as he was willing to be known. She thought about Nathan's words. "Tell Grandma I forgive her. She knows what she did." Everyone had assumed it was Robert speaking. Robert, forgiving Eleanor for 30 years of enforced silence in the erasure of his firstborn son. But Claire stood in the hallway with the DNA test in her hand and thought, what if it wasn't Robert? What if it was Thomas? 60 years of absence given a single, improbable voice, forgiving an old woman who had spent the last year of her life trying, too late, to undo the things she'd spent the rest of her life maintaining. She picked up her phone and called Spokane. When Thomas answered, she said, "I found something. Eleanor, she knew. She confirmed it herself. She was going to tell you. She tried." He was quiet. She waited. "I know," he said. She waited for him to explain. He didn't, not immediately. When he spoke again, his voice was careful, measured, the voice of a man who had gotten used to not having his experience believed. "About 3 months ago, I had a dream," he said. "An old woman standing in a hallway. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me the way people look when they've run out of time to say the thing they needed to say." He paused. "I woke up feeling like something had ended, like a door had finally closed that had been standing open my whole life." 3 months ago, Claire said. "What month was that?" A beat of silence. "November, early November, I think." Claire sat down on the hallway floor. Through the back door, she could see Nathan in the yard, kicking a ball against the fence, not watching anyone, not observing anything, just playing, finally, the ordinary way. 4 years old, nearly 5. A boy who had been unconscious for 11 hours in November and woken up with someone else's grief in his mouth. Early November, the same week. She sat on the floor a long time. Then she put Eleanor's envelope in her pocket, where she would keep it until she could put it into Thomas's hands directly. In the spring, she drove Nathan to Spokane. He didn't ask where they were going. He sat in the back seat and watched the highway the whole way, that careful, ancient attention she had never been able to name, and said nothing. When they arrived, Thomas Voss Crawford opened his front door. An old man, a stranger, with Robert Calloway's jaw and the patient eyes of someone who had spent 60 years learning how to wait. Nathan looked up at him. Something passed across his face, not the stranger shyness of a child meeting someone new, not the discomfort of unfamiliarity, something quiet and completed, like a breath finally let out. He smiled. Claire had seen her son smile thousands of times. She had never once seen him smile at someone the way you smile at someone you have been missing for a very long time. She did not say anything. She put her hand on Nathan's shoulder and stood there, and let the three of them exist in the same air for a moment. Later, driving home, Nathan asleep in the back seat, the envelope delivered, the circle finally, imperfectly closed. Claire thought about the last thing Thomas had said to her before they left. He had been holding Eleanor's letter, reading it one more time. He'd looked up at Nathan, then back at Claire, and said quietly, "Do you think he knew what he was doing when he woke up in the hospital?" Claire had thought about it for a long moment. "I think," she said, "that whatever needed to happen used the only door it could find." Thomas had nodded. He folded the letter carefully and held it the way you hold something you have been waiting for without knowing you were waiting. "It was a very small door," he said. "Yes," Claire said. "It was." She looked at Nathan, asleep against the car window, his breath fogging the glass in the cold. 4 years old, 5 years old, just a boy. Just her boy. And she thought, whatever you carried, you can put it down now. She didn't know if he heard her. She said it anyway. Then she looked away from him, back at the road, and something else moved through her, quieter than fear, colder than comfort. Nathan had never met Thomas, had never seen a photograph, had never heard his name spoken in their home, not once, not ever. And yet, when Thomas opened that door, Nathan had smiled at him, immediately, without hesitation, the way you smile at someone you've been looking for. Not the way a child smiles at a stranger, the way you smile when someone you lost has finally been found.